Thanks very much for being here today. Great panel. Looking forward to the conversation. Just a word, I think, so TAM is topical, certainly, in the downturn, but to me, as a startup veteran, like operationally, it's just one of those basic issues everyone has to confront at some point if you want to be a founder. So this is more of a how-to generic conversation about TAM, not much about like the moment, I think, but diving right in. Great panel. So let's start with our terms. What are TAM, SAM, and SOM? Total addressable market, serviceable addressable market, and serviceable obtainable market. So just an example might be, if we're thinking about natural dog treats, TAM might be anyone who goes to the pet food aisle. SAM would be folks who want healthy dog food treats specifically, and SOM would be how much you could actually sell to that group in the second group. Is that more or less correct, or? Okay,
yeah, good
great.
framework.
Awesome.
Great framework.
So yeah, basically, it's like this is a tool for investors to let them know the upside potential for them, basically. So, questions. First question: when are back of the napkin calculations okay for TAM? And I want to start with Kara.
I generally think if it depends on the stage you're coming into an investment, but they're completely fine in the early days of an investment, and then I think you do need kind of a sense of either how big it is right now or how big it can become, mostly to convince people to give you money. I tend to think about TAM at the earliest stage of investing as most helpful in understanding why is a founder or operator choosing to operate in this market, and how do they think, more so than are their numbers exactly right? Because as we know, so many of the best businesses end up being ones that create TAM or create market size. I mean, my sneakers are a great example of that. When Upfront invested in GOAT in the early stage, everyone thought sneakers were a teeny market, and I can talk more about it later if it's helpful. But if you buy one pair of sneakers a year, your TAM is one size. If you buy 10, in a year and you start buying a ton more because you're not wearing work shoes, it's another size. So, but to answer your question, I would say more important to be able to articulate how big something can become and to show that you have a thought process around TAM if it's early. And if you're going public, you better know what your TAM is and all of the other acronyms. Otherwise, you're probably not going to get the equity analyst to underwrite you in the right way.
Aydin, to you, is it okay to walk in with kind of numbers that seem okay, or do you need to research before you, like how much research do you really need to do before you
Look,
present
I
yourself?
think the truth of this is like looking at the title of the session, I think with TAM, it's almost guaranteed you're going to be wrong. It's either going to be too large or too small. Directional is important. I think there are two things that we do more than the TAM that we see on the presentation or we hear from the founders. We do our own back-end calculation because we're not even going to pick a conversation unless we're interested in the market. And if we are, we're already looking at, hey, are there public comps, just to get an idea of like what the rough market size is. So that was like a really great analogy that I got from some of our founders is like, listen, like the public comps represent if there is money in the market or not. And we also do, just like Deena, also frontier deals where sometimes the market doesn't even exist. So it's hard to get the TAM. I think the thing that we're looking more than anything else is how the founders arrive at the number. And part of that is we have this true north of we want to see how articulate the founders are. So how they got to that number is much more important than the number itself. I know for many VCs, they look at that number as a proxy for if it's big enough, then the company, if things work, it's going to be great. I think the more important is you're starting to arrive at the formula of if things work, how it's going to work, and how you're going to get at the great result. I think everybody looks at the results, but the more important part is the formula. And I think the important thing about TAM is in the quest to calculate TAM, you're essentially now trying to reverse engineer what your success formula is going to be, going through the steps. So that is much more important, how they thought about it for us. As well as obviously having done our homework, what is our own conviction and is there a delta and variance, and if so, how can we look into that?
And Deena, to you, how much of your due diligence has spent looking at this number?
Yeah, so I think Kara made a really good point, which I want to start by emphasizing in that the sort of discussion around TAM and the focus on TAM is going to vary from stage to stage. So I'll start by talking about the earliest stage. With another caveat that at Lux, we love to invest in, what we call matter that matters, frontier tech, deep tech, take your term of choice. But we like to invest before it's obvious, and that usually means there either isn't a TAM or people think that there's a TAM that's too small. I think a great example of that is an area where I've personally invested a lot, which is in the fertility space, where just a few years ago, it was really ignored by venture because if you did a very basic TAM calculation, the number of families going through IVF times whatever the cost of a cycle is, it does look small. The way that we thought about it when we started to invest relatively early vis-a-vis other venture funds was actually looking at changing global demographics. So the average age that families are thinking about babies, the number of LGBTQ couples that are looking at going through surrogacy, the trends in other countries where there actually are much better rates of reimbursement and therefore fertility is more accessible. That's how we thought about TAM. And so and at that early stage where we're actually helping to create a market, that's where it's much more important.
So is it fair to say TAM is more of it's a way of framing your business, not necessarily presenting like what you're going to do and how you're going to operate?
Exactly. I mean, as Aydin said, if we're taking the meeting, we ostensibly think there's something there that's interesting enough to be potentially venture backable. But also to your point, the way it's calculated, the way the founder is thinking about it is telling to us, not about necessarily the business or its future, but about how the founder thinks about company creation. And that's much more important at the earliest stage.
So in your experience, and collectively, this is for all of you, like founders who have trouble fixing, like kind of framing TAM when they come to you, are they kind of problematic with other things down the road? Is that kind of a fair assumption? Or?
I mean, look, I think when we think about how we make decisions and how we choose founders, I'm not really sure TAM is really in like the top 3 or even top 5 of the factors. The more important thing is the product and the moats. And the way that we think about it is like, in addition to public comps as a reality check, a lot of the bets we made at Felicis, like if I look at the things that did work, is always, hey, if it works, it's a platform, or if it works, it could be used by a lot of people. Like fertility is like a good example that Deena used, but like, we had some bets where like, okay, like, hey, listen, like if this works, it can cure cancer or diagnose cancer without have to have a biopsy, and that became a public company. We had a company that programmed bacteria, and if it works, like it can, like there are chemical companies that really need this. We have Ginkgo Bioworks, public company, like doing $100 million deals. If you can be the commerce platform, Shopify became a $100 billion company. Payments, like you almost don't need a TAM calculation. Payments is literally how every business works. So if a company can become a major company, they're going to capture a lot of value out of it. And you can see that the largest giants in that field have huge market cap. So I think one of the most important things is like, how does the founder choose a market and how do they think they can have a role in it? So it's almost like TAM is an excuse to actually go to the heart of the question, which is, hey, if you want to get to a great spot, how much have you thought about the formula to get there? How much have you planned, and how articulate is the plan? And the plan doesn't have to be accurate. The plan has to be directionally correct, and what goes in the plan is kind of like what we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just really important to say, again, I think at the earliest stage, the founder's why is so much more important than any specific thing. I used to actually have this rubric of the 5 things I would look at that were measurements of, should I spend time on something or not? Because I still think fast no's are a bigger gift, much bigger gift than long maybes for founders. Market size was always something that was important to consider, right? Because if you're in a market where, if you're building, I invested in this company called Endgame, for example, which is doing customer relationship management for product-led growth companies. Everyone understands that TAM could be enormous, and that's the way so many companies are going to market. Then you have to assume that there's going to be 5 or 10 competitors, versus if you're trying to cure cancer, it's kind of a little bit more bimodal. Like, does it work or does it not work? Yeah. And if it works, wow, that could be really big. Another company I backed was a company called Writer. There's a big, I think, article about a company in the consumer space you guys did today called Jasper, that they compete in the enterprise space around AI writing and style guides and language. And when I first met that founder, she was in the translation market. She was an Arabic woman who had an experience, like her why was she had to translate back and forth from English to Arabic. And so she started in translation. What?
She's one of my best friends from college. I love May. Yeah.
May Habib, so we can celebrate May here. And she was just remarkable. Her why was so real. And she started in this little teeny segment. And I went on this journey to call all of these investors who had been in predecessor companies on the translation space to find out if anyone would then fund it downstream. Okay, people have funded it downstream because that was her small aperture on TAM to now go into the massive market of how do you help people write better, smarter, on style guide, et cetera. And that's, I don't know how big it is. I'll go with $1 trillion. But it started in this really teeny area. So I think the why and then understanding how much competition you're going to have for your early customers are kind of the most critical things to understand early stage. And then later stage, you have to show you can get into bigger and bigger segments and take that early success and expand out.
I just want to tease out something I think is very important, which is a lot of the discussion we're having right now is TAM in a pitch. I think the more important function of TAM as a founder is what problem are you going to solve, what company are you going to create. So the two really interesting things that I learned, so we had this great founder, Hans Robertson, who was co-founder of Meraki and now co-founder and chairman of Verkada. And when he went after the camera business, everybody said camera business, that's commoditized, there's so many companies. And his rule was, listen, if every building and every household is a camera, that's a pretty big market. Like, I don't have to worry that there is money in this market. And then I can always use technology as an angle and reinvent the product to such a degree. Apple iPhone is a great example. Until it came along, everybody thought phones could only be 9-button, 12-button devices, and now it's like the device to rule them all. And so the second interesting example was from another founder of ours who had a very simple proxy. It's like, listen, all the businesses I'm interested in founding or getting involved in are simply if there is a business, if there's an ad for them on TV. Because if there is an ad for anything on TV, it's big enough that people are spending money, and it's a big enough market that it's going to reach to enough people, which then will justify the ads. Anyway, I'm not saying that that is the rule. I'm just giving you a concrete example of maybe it's more relevant in how you choose, like which business you're going to go after. And I think us as a VCs is a lot less that, hey, is it going to be a yes or no decision based on that calculation, even though it's more like, hey, that discussion might nudge you to then pivot and think of something else that might be bigger and more interesting. So that's where basically it can really be a great tool for you and a great tool in your tool chest.
Yeah, there's no seed deck that looks anything like a Series A, let alone B, C, D, and beyond to the public filing. We all know that. And so we take with a grain of salt how a TAM is calculated. What's much more important is the founder market fit, which has definitely come up here, and the ability and the grit and the resilience of that founder that we have to evaluate. And so I think we can tell if a founder has just done some calculations and got excited about a TAM and thinks it could make a lot of money. That's probably not going to be a long-term successful company, right? But if the founder has that deep personal connection and is willing to put what it takes to take it to those next few levels, that's where the TAM starts to look exciting.
Okay, so a crazy TAM in the room is not a red flag necessarily then. It's just a signal to consider.
Not a red flag, could be a red herring.
I mean, I can speak about this as a founder. I co-founded the first majority female-owned, female-led professional sports team in the country called Angel City. We're a soccer team, yes, in LA, football, for those of us from the land where football was created. When I was first raising for it, I got 100 no's. I mean, literally 100 no's, because there was no TAM. Right? Even today, there's $1 billion of broadcast revenue to watch women's sports versus $500 billion for men's sports. So that's a trailing indicator. Flash forward 3 years, now lots of people are offering us money. We're selling out stadiums. We have $40 million in contracted sponsorship revenue. But the authenticity of the pitch you would have heard from me was from my deep conviction that the current TAM was not indicative of where the TAM would be. And so I think I can speak about it from both angles, just even in the last few years. And I probably did a pretty good job of explaining TAM, having been on the other side of it for a long time. But the reality is the best leading indicator I had at the time was Instagram. So if you see passionate connection and commitment to wanting a thing, like the consumer love part of it, and that was the only indicator I had was player following on Instagram. And fortunately, I got one investor to believe that that was a leading indicator, and 99 who didn't.
I do want to chime in on that. I think the reason why TAM is important is if this works, is it exciting enough? But what I will tell you, what is a true red flag, we truly believe in intellectual honesty. In the quest to come up with a really, really large number, thinking that that large number will be the true north and will influence and drive the VCs, if that number is not correlated to a real calculation or real thinking, I do think that that is a red flag. right? So like it is very, like that's why how you arrived at the number, or at least that it's directionally interesting or correct, is much more important than absolute significance or the magnitude of the number, but it cannot be something that is literally pulled out of the thin air that you use like chewing gum and duct tape to like say, okay, it's like roughly this, and it basically makes it obvious that you kind of like came up with a very large number and tried to justify it versus really did a true bottoms-up calculation. And again, it's not important what the number is, it's important that it's directionally interesting enough, but make sure it is not like disconnected from reality, which to me is a red flag.
Thanks for that. And actually, let's get into process. You mentioned kind of bottom up. So there are different ways to calculate TAM for different sectors, different kinds of companies and products. Do you, for a first-time founder who has no experience doing this before, do you have a recommended, do you recommend top-down, bottom-up, something more like value theory where you're thinking about pricing? What's starting with you?
I mean, I think the insight behind it is more important than the absolute calculation. Like I was just kind of reflecting on what Deena said and what Kara said. We made a bet, for instance, in a company that is reinventing sugar. I mean, how do you even like figure out what the TAM is? But all I thought about, every human being in the world loves sweet. Like I don't know if somebody that doesn't like sweet, maybe they like it less, but we all are driven, like naturally like to crave sugar. And if we had a better alternative of sugar that had less calories, less glycemic index, it's actually good for you, we might solve obesity. So the absolute number is not as relevant. So then the only thing is, look, if you can make this, can you make it at enough scale and a price that's attractive enough? If you do, it's going to be successful. If not, it's not going to be successful. Whether that market is like billions or tens of billions, look, I know it's going to be important because we've already seen what Impossible Food did. Like, hey, how much demand is there for vegan burgers? And it looks like there is pretty big demand. So I think same thing, like when we were thinking about like diagnosing cancer or curing cancer, it wasn't like, yeah, we do know that it could be bimodal. It's the kind of thing is, if it works, is it significant enough? When we thought about Shopify and like commerce or Aydin and payments or like many other companies and enterprise that we think of, it's all like, listen, would every business care about this, right? Or would like every business need to do this? And there are certain things that every human being craves or wants to do, like either personally or as a family. And there are certain things that every business like needs to process a payment. They need to have an office, blah, blah, blah. And so there are like 10 or 20 things. So like the most important thing is that you're solving one of those things and not something that is such a niche and so esoteric that, hey, we have technology that allows chip makers to do this, like blah, blah, blah. And I'm like 20 like PowerPoint slides, whatever, and you need a PhD to understand it. If it's that complicated, then I'm not interested. So it doesn't matter if the calculation is correct or great. At that point, you've already lost me. It's more important that even an elementary school student can understand that if it works, why is it going to be a big market?
I'll take a quick crack at it and hand it over to Deena over there. But I think, here, I'll go in a slightly different direction. I agree with everything I just said. But if you're pitching VCs, just find a friend from Bain or McKinsey, get it all sorted, get ready to go. What actually really matters is how you're going to spend the next minute, hour, week, month. And so in the beginning, it's just how do you build something people love and want to buy again and want to tell their friends about? And then you have to do all the other things to build a business. But so how do you use TAM calculations, customer insights, segmentation? You can get too far ahead of yourself in the beginning, but to answer those questions around how do you as a founder spend your time to on the most important things to figure out how to build a business that people love and want to pay for right now and then pay more for over time. I think once you get into the later stages, I started early, I was the first investor in a company called Parachute Home back when they were raising, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a very hard segment to get funded by venture capitalists in the early days because you had companies like Casper and all these other companies who could sell a couple $1,000 mattresses one time. The thing, like when you're a founder in a category like that I would think about is how do you get different behavior out of your customer? Because a lot of VCs or investors just take the kind of the laziest thinking around cohorts and repeat rates and things that they can measure early versus taking a bet on how do you get to bigger systemic changing companies in an industry. And for Parachute, it was repeat rates. You took something that people were buying once every 7 years, sheets, and you were moving it up and they were getting people buying it 3-4 times a year, seasonally, like a lot like sneakers and what happened with GOAT. And then over time, it's like, okay, sheets is an $8 billion TAM in the United States. That's small, right? right? But home furnishings is the third largest spend after probably insurance and homes in the United States. So how do you as a founder think about, a right to win, adding on different SKUs, changing your pricing? But it all starts with find people who love it, are going to tell their friends, are going to come back, and are going to come back more often in a different way than others. And so I think an ability to articulate how it is you do that and to hold yourself accountable as a founder is really important. Okay, that wasn't super short, but now I'll hand it.
No, I think that was great. What you both said, I totally agree with. I'll add maybe a healthcare specific focus because that is where I spend a lot of my time, which is, I think where things can get a little complicated when it comes to TAM calculation. It's one thing if you're doing a purely cash paid direct to consumer facing healthcare product, but if you're really scaling and trying to get deep into the the communities in this country, especially that need healthcare the most, you're talking about working with payers and managed care. You need to figure out how to align values. And I think we've seen recently what can happen when you don't align those values and what can, and the incentives are skewed. But there's a really big opportunity when you can actually crack the nut around these really sticky stakeholders in healthcare. And so that's something that we like to think about as well. And that actually does get a little more complex from a calculation perspective. Mm-hmm. What are the billing codes? How much are payers willing to pay now? Where I get excited is where none of those exist yet, and where we can actually make a case to improve outcomes and get the payers excited about it. Our investment in Maven Clinic is an excellent example of that, where there wasn't a lot of data about how virtual care can actually improve outcomes, reduce C-section incidence of C-sections, and help support fertility counseling. Nobody was thinking about fertility counseling a few years ago. What does that even mean? And now we know that on the employer side, young people as young as 18, 19 years old are starting to think about their future fertility. And so this is actually a large driver and a cost center. So, being able to learn from our prior investments and having the insight from the big employers and payers is also one way of calculating or thinking about calculating a TAM before it really exists.
I'm just thinking about something Kara just mentioned. You mentioned in passing, I think you said $8 billion. It's kind of a small TAM, and I had wrapped my head around that for a second. I understand that venture capitalists are thinking at a different scale than I'm thinking about, or a first-time founder. But so in a row, like starting with you, Kara, what's too small? What's too small a TAM for you to even bother with? If someone said to you, I think I can tap into this amazing $2 billion a year industry. Is that you're going to pass on that, or?
Well, me as Kara Norton, nothing. I honestly, I really think over time, if I've been in venture and operating now for 25 years, even though I look so young, it's hard to imagine.
Started when you were 2.
And and I think still the most important thing is, why is that person doing that thing, and how did they get that insight, and why is it they're going to run through walls and make sacrifices that don't make any sense in terms of their family and their personal life? So, but to answer it, I think it's a real thing in venture. It's a thing that's really changed over the course of the 25 years. I started as an associate at Battery Ventures in the late 90s, and we got excited about multi-$100 million outcomes, and it's one of the best long-standing firms around. So short answer, I think everybody went from how do I, the unicorn and the $1 billion company to the $100 billion company, but I think we're going back a little to fundamentals now, which I think is good for everyone, including founders and the like, because everyone who does well in startup land will live a good life, right, from an economic standpoint. And so what I would say is, I think you're going to see firms that won't underwrite something that is going to be less than a $100 billion company. I don't think that's going away, but I also think you're going to see a segmentation in the market where you can find people who really care about the work they do in smaller markets and smaller outcomes. And what's most important to answer that question is, what's your handshake with your investor? What is the outcome that they're looking for over what period of time, and does that line up with your TAM, your ambitions, how you want to build your company, how much you want to burn, how much risk you want to take on as a founder? I think a lot of that dialogue, it was lost in the last few years, where everyone just wanted to market that they wanted to be a $100 billion company, and I think a lot of people actually don't. And I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of founders sold early because of that pressure, and they probably were some of the most likely founders to actually get there. So $8 billion is plenty for me. Yeah. Plenty for me.
I think this last point is really important, because every VC that comes on a panel here, nobody ever talks about like the small wins they have. They only talk about the biggest wins they have. And I think this is an interesting point that gets lost, especially to this last point. So to the TAM point, like I can think of two examples, like one of our companies, like the bet that I made a decade ago, Accompli, was mobile email before like Outlook and Gmail was available. Oh, Gmail was available on mobile, but Outlook wasn't. And so it ended up being an acquisition in Microsoft, and the team like helped Microsoft Outlook become one of the biggest like mobile apps. So the outcome for us was maybe small, but the end result was literally like the maximum that that company could be, and we still work with those founders, and other things have happened. So I think one of the point that I wanted to make, and then there was a second case where, you know, similar to Deena, like I am really passionate about education, and I made a bet in health education. I was really worried about health in this country, and that one of the things we have is a supply shock. We have limitation. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough people. Even if you want to fix people and cure people, there are not enough people that are doing that, and we just cannot train them fast enough. So I backed a company called Osmosis, and I thought, hey, this works, like could be really big, and that got acquired by Elsevier, and probably like 2-3 steps later, it's going to go into it, and maybe it wasn't a big outcome as Shopify and Adyen, but it was still meaningful to me that at the end it's going to like, you know, succeed with that mission. And the reason why I'm saying that is, you know, we're only giving you the VC perspective, but from a founder perspective, it's also enough that if a VC believes in you, even if the number is maybe not $8 billion, whatever, maybe eventually it can become like to that number, but if they're literally only looking at that number and whether that number is a yes or no, that's also the wrong investor for you. Whether there's another investor that truly has heart, you know, we believe in your dream, we truly believe in you, and we all truly agree that this is a problem worth solving. This is just an excuse, it's like interesting enough to spend time on it, and I think that's also something for you to think about.
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, I teach at Stanford Business School a class called Startup Garage, which is the class that DoorDash came out of and Guild Education, and yeah, about 25% of them go on to be venture-backed companies. We have a whole section on TAM. I'm going to apply some of these learnings. Thanks, guys. But one of the things I tell them, which is really very tactical and basic but good advice, is like when you're doing a pitch, think about who you're pitching to. And it really is a different calculation and a different calculus for an angel, for a seed investor that has, you know, 10 million AUM, for a large fund that has 10 billion AUM.
Yeah.
And it's not a coincidence that, you know, the larger that AUM gets, it's usually at later stage rounds where the calculation can actually be made in a more mathematical way. And that number is going to be different each time. And so that basic knowledge I would want to arm every founder with, because, you know, I'm not going to say your TAM should be different each time. Obviously, you should know what your TAM is, but you should know what the VC you're pitching to or the investor you're pitching to is trying to do in returning their fund, what outcome they're looking for. Because what might not be a big outcome for our funds would be a life-changing outcome for an angel and a very big outcome for a seed fund. So.
And all I wanted to say is even those small numbers like add up, like, I mean, I had like 9 IPOs now, but I still remember my first exit, which was only 1.5, and it was 75K. And, you know, as a personal angel investor, I'm like, I'm not going to fail at this. Money actually could also come back as it can go out. So it is a really important thing.
And I love what you said. I mean, people who believe in the dream. I mean, I just think it's so important to find investors who really believe in you and your dream. I think probably all three of us have done things that made no sense from a TAM standpoint simply because we wanted to work with this human being that inspired us. And I think about 2 acquisitions in the companies I was fortunate enough to invest in during COVID. One was a company called Fleetsmith that Apple bought. Another was a company called Strive Talent that Franklin Covey bought. Both could have gone on to be much, 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 much bigger outcomes. They're some of my favorite founders I've ever worked with. They're all my favorite. And I was very sad the day that they that they left my day-to-day life. And I think we put each other on each other's personal board of directors at that point in time. But I think when we all look back on the way we spent our time, it's going to be wanting to be on the personal board of directors and vice versa of those people and the purpose and joy we get and the energy we get working with each other. And again, I think a lot of that is lost in the heavy transactional nature of venture, and down markets present us all with an opportunity to really reconsider why we're doing what we do.
Totally.
Question I had, and it's also a question from the audience: how should pre-revenue startups consider TAM if you don't have anything? Or I'm sorry, I consider some in terms of approaching your revenue. How do you predict when you don't have anything to draw from? For especially a brand new thing like I'm going to turn people's cars into taxis or turn their homes into hotels. How do you come up with a number for something that really doesn't exist yet?
I mean, I think one way to think about it is, so this is a really good example because I did completely fail to appreciate the potential of Uber. I love driving cars, and I would probably be the lost investor because I'm like, I love driving a car. Why would anybody want a car? Until you realize like how difficult it is to get a cab or whatever. And similarly, like I think I overestimated the risk of Airbnb. I think this is where a good way to do it as a proxy is, listen, how large is the transportation market is in like cabs and private cars? So, and I think like to Kara's point of like, if all of a sudden it changes so much where it becomes like utility, if the price and convenience increases, would you do it like 10 times as much? Right, so a lot of times like the markets are limited, not because the market is limited, but the UI is limited. Similarly, like, hey, you use your phone as a communication device, value is limited. All of a sudden it's a computer, value is like 100x, right? So similarly, you're just using cab, like it's a sucky experience, Uber, it's a great experience. Now all of a sudden the TAM is like 10 to 100 times larger. That's the reason why we like thinking of public comms. So like if it's Airbnb, well, listen, you look at hotel companies, they might be sucky, and even being sucky, they have a huge comp. Like that was the interesting thing that happened to us at Verkada is that cameras, it might be sucky, it might be commodity, but you look at like camera companies like Honeywell, whatever, they're like awful like dinosaur companies and they have like tens of $billions in like market value. And then you're like, wow, like maybe the market doesn't suck that bad. So the calculation doesn't have to be super accurate, but it like tells you, hey, listen, this is like an important enough market that if you're brave enough to think of like a unique solution that nobody thought about, it's probably worth going after.
You know, there are ways you can try to convince yourself that you're calculating some early on, right? You can talk to would-be customers and so on. And I think, you know, maybe some of the early investors in Uber and Airbnb would like to think that they were geniuses in those early days and were totally prescient and imagined this whole thing. But like, let's be honest, at the end of the day, a lot of it, most of it, I would say, comes down to you see it. You see it, you believe in the founder, you believe in the team, you think there could be something interesting that this person does with this seed of an idea, and that's that.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was at IAC, I incubated what turned into Tinder, and that was a crazy story. I was pregnant with my third daughter. I was definitely not using it, and or at least that's the story I tell. No, I really was not using it.
Breaking news here.
And it was like one of those where like everyone knew the SOM was going to be huge, but nobody knew how huge. But it was so important to IAC, which owned Match at the time, that the thing I ended up incubating was incubated out of City Search, which was a sort of like consumer brand that was not easy to manage at the time. And it was being incubated all over the place. So like there, it was just very well understood. You know, there was one at Match, there was one in OkCupid, there was one in corporate, and there was one at City Search, and we just couldn't afford to get it wrong because the SOM was so perceived to be so large. Mm-hmm. You know, right before, you know, I started looking at mental health like every other VC. I think every VC starts looking at mental health because we all question our mental health. It's like just part of our journey, no matter what we do. But it's an important area, obviously. And I'm, you know, somebody in my YPO forum was starting an astrology company, and it's like, oh God, what's the SOM of astrology on mobile phones? But you know, and this sort of thing. But if you actually move it into where coaching and therapy, and actually, you know, there's all the things beyond that. That's one of those things that's just very hard to explain, and where analogies as to how people are going to kind of show up and have a hypothesis about how to be happier, healthier, live a better version of themselves. Who knows how you calculate that? You just go out to people, you get them using their service, and you try to figure it out over time. So I think it's a lot more art than science. I truly think it comes back to the why at the early stage, and then you just have to sharpen your pencils and be a lot more crisp about it in the later stage.
I mean, look, that's a really good example on the SOM point, like on mental health. Like, I don't know who was the earliest on record, but I'd like to claim that I was one of the earliest where people like were asking when Facebook went public, you've been like very early at Google, what's the next Facebook? And I told them actually it could be a mental health company because I thought like health is 25% of GDP. All the physical health is solved, mental health is not solved. We all have brains, we all have like mental issues, and it can't be diagnosed. You could be 10% obsessive compulsive. I probably have 10 mental diseases. Like I joke with my wife and I can still be functional, but like imagine like if you could be a better person and human being. And so like we maybe got like the first 5 investments wrong, but I guarantee you mental health is gonna be a huge area. And so I think like to this point, like you can actually really like use this more than the sum itself. Hey, listen, is this an interesting area? And then it gives you like an idea of like why does this market like is not unlocked yet, and it's until that, and it like TAM then like or sum leads you to the product insight. It's like, oh, that's the insight that if that changes, the market changes. And again, like if you all can take away from today, it's not the number itself, but like thinking about the number, can it actually lead you to something a lot bigger than what the number was gonna do, right? Like it can lead you to the product insight or the moat that ends up like either like having you do the biggest company that you can create in that area, or actually like to Kara's point, like, oh no, like that made me think of this other thing, maybe that's the thing to go after rather than this thing that if I do, you know, and I solve it, what does it mean versus if this bigger thing, if you solve it, the impact is gonna be so much bigger.
So I've worked with a few founders helping them on their pitch decks, and in every case, 3 or 4 people, TAM slide was the hardest, most existential dread. And I know one person who basically decided not to start up because they thought the numbers were just too fanciful and plucked from thin air. And what I'm hearing today, I think my biggest takeaway is that maybe I've been overthinking this number, and I think the founders I've worked with have also been overthinking this number. Is that a fair assumption? It sounds like the process is more the thing than the number itself. So,
I mean, I would say if the founder, by the way, didn't move ahead, it means that the authenticity to what they wanted to do wasn't as real as it should have been, and then that was probably like it was a very positive for them. So yeah, I mean, I really think like the thing that I started where I'm a maker, this soccer team called Angel City. It was like an earned insight over my life, and it's sort of like, you know, the Stanford disease, and I went to Stanford too, so I can say that I'm a self-hater, which is like everyone comes through Stanford and wants to be an entrepreneur, and the greatest entrepreneurs in the world come through Stanford. It's amazing, but so many people just sort of see the role played on television and think they want to be that role, and so I think, you know, I started a few different things, but the one I started that I didn't intend to start, I didn't intend to start a soccer team. That sounds crazy. I had a full-time job and I'm a working mom, but it was so authentic to, I just believed this should exist in the world and there was nothing that was going to stop me from doing it. I didn't need to own it, I just wanted it to exist. And so I don't think it's as important if that's how you feel about what needs to exist in the world. And then have somebody help you, talk about like, how important is it? It's really important for you to get TAM right if you worked in an organization where you learned how to scope TAMs. It's like Ray Dalio's believability index, right? If you worked at Bain, BCG, McKinsey, you don't know how to talk about TAM, that is probably a problem. If you are an influencer who grew up on YouTube or a scientist who's been in a lab trying to cure cancer, it's, to me, at the early stage, it's much less important. It's sort of how much do you care to learn about getting that right over time so people will listen to you who are a little bit more superficial in their analysis or to show your thinking. But it's not, I don't think it's as important if it's the work you're supposed to be doing and you're there for the right reasons and you're not going to sleep until this thing gets done.
Absolutely.
Would you agree?
That's what every VC looks for, is that burning desire to solve a problem, to work on something, not, a hammer looking for a nail, but truly dedicating your life in an almost really irrational way to building something and seeking partners, investors, who want to invest because it makes sense for them too. And that alignment of incentives and that alignment of energy and that alignment of excitement can produce really beautiful things. And if somebody wants to dedicate their life's work to something that doesn't have a big TAM, great, they can do that, and they can, sell cool shoelaces on Etsy or, whatever it is that their passion is, and that doesn't have to be a venture-backed company. But if they do and they want to go down that path, we're here, we're excited.
I mean, I'm just gonna wrap maybe with an example, because it's really different. We're just looking at a defense company and how do you calculate the defense TAM? And there are $100 billion plus companies like Lockheed, whatever. But it was until the founder started showing us, well, this is how the US and the allies are using it to help Ukraine. And this would be the difference of if we were to go against China and they started demonstrating the product and we all fell off our chairs. So I think where I'm going with this is your motivation and the product you're building and the moat is so much more important. And I think the thing that we need more than anything else is how much heart is in this product and how cool is the product. TAM is only one element of a number. And I think the bigger thing here is the storytelling. You could also have like a terrible TAM or sum, but have such a great story that people still want to work with you, right? Like, and I think that's the reason why I wanted to give you some examples of companies that didn't end up being outcomes, and it hopefully eventually will as a result of, you know, the M&A outcome or whatever. But it's still, I'm like, I still had the heart when I saw that, like, I cannot not back this product and this founder. Like, it's just like impossible. And so I think capturing that magic moment and being good at storytelling is probably like more important than TAM. And I'm not saying TAM is not important, but maybe like use TAM as an excuse to get your storytelling and the overall product story.
That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thanks so much. This has been a great panel. I appreciate it.
Thank you.